The Devil and George Lukens. A 1778 exorcism in Bristol. This is the true story of George Lukens. But before we continue, smash that subscribe button and leave us your thoughts in the comments section below. Now relax and listen carefully to our voices.
And don't close your eyes. You might find us near you. On May 31st, 1778, the Reverend Joseph Easterbrook, Anglican vicar of the now abandoned Temple Church in Bristol, England, was called in on what would become the most bizarre case of his clerical career. Sarah Baber, a member of his parish, had recently visited the nearby town of Yatton, where she came across a man suffering from a very strange malady. According to MRS Baber, the man in question, 40-something former tailor named George Lukens, experienced daily fits, during which he sang and screamed in various sounds, some of which did not resemble the modifications of a human voice. And he cursed and swore in a most tremendous manner while in his fits, and declared that doctors could do him no service. Having lived in Yatton many years previously, MRS Baber knew George Lukens and his entire family, and described him as a good church-going man who had shown no problems until his strange fits began 18 years before. The Lukens family had already tried taking George to various medical doctors. None of them had any clue about what was happening to cause these strange episodes. As for George Lukens himself, he seemed as mystified as anyone over what was happening. According to his own testimony, his possession began while he was performing a mummer's play at Christmas time, and he experienced what he called a divine slap, possibly alcohol, related according to some people who knew him at the time. Almost immediately afterward, his bizarre seizures started, including his making strange barking sounds and uncontrollable twitching of the right hand. Many of the local townspeople suggested that George's fits were due to being bewitched, an opinion that George himself seemed to share. In fact, he had recently begun claiming that his fits were caused by his being possessed by 7 demons, and that 7 clergymen would be needed to drive them out. Hence the reason for Sarah Baber approaching the Reverend Easterbrook for his help. A few days later, the good vicar arranged for George to be brought to Bristol so he could be examined directly. As Easterbrook later reported, his colleagues who had come to see Lukens for themselves were struck with horror and amazement at the sounds and expressions which they heard, and the unaccountable agitations and convulsions which they beheld. Satisfied that he was dealing with a genuine possession case, Easterbrook searched for clerics to help with the exorcism. Unfortunately for him, this was more difficult than he thought, since too many of his colleagues were skeptics concerning whether George was possessed rather than insane. Despite efforts by Easterbrook and others to be as discreet as possible about the attempted exorcism, a June 11th letter to the Bristol Gazette, written by an anonymous source, made that impossible. The letter described George Lukens as the most singular case of perverted reason and bodily suffering that I ever heard of. Nor have the most learned and ingenious men been able to solve the phenomenon, much less to administer relief to the afflicted object. You may depend on the authenticity of every part of the relation. A member of my family having been near 30 years minister of a place where the person resides, many of my friends still inhabiting it, and myself having been frequently a witness to the facts I shall mention. Suddenly, the Yatton Demoniac was front page news, and the discreet exorcism that Easterbrook had been planning became a public event. When the vicar met with 6 of his colleagues in a vestry room at Temple Church to pray for Lukens, a considerable number of people planted themselves upon the walls of the vestry room and heard part of the prayers, the singing, the conversation, and the wonderful sounds which proceeded from George Lukens, and carried some account of these circumstances to a printer who instantly dispatched papers upon the subject through the streets of Bristol and its vicinage. The 18th century version of Facebook, in other words, prevent some of the wild stories that were already starting to spread. Easterbrook and the others published their own account of what happened when they met with Lukens. According to this new account, which was published on June 18th in the Bristol Gazette, when they began singing an hymn, on which Lukens' was immediately thrown into strange agitations, very different from his usual seizures. His face was variously distorted, and his whole body strongly convulsed. His right hand and arm then began to shake with violence, and after some violent throes, Weiss spake in a deep, hoarse, hollow voice, personating an invisible agent, calling the man to an account, and upbraiding him as a tool for bringing that silly company together. He then began to sing in his usual manner, still personam, laying some invisible agent, horribly blaspheming, boasted of his usual power, and vowed eternal vengeance on the miserable object, and on those present daring to oppose him, and commanded his faithful and obedient servants to appear. Despite these terrifying antics, the clerics continued to pray and to command the demons inhabiting him to return to hell. Finally, the object of their prayers shouted out, "Blessed Jesus," and his seizure suddenly stopped. Lukens calmly thanked the clerics for what they had done for him and insisted that he was cured. As proof, he recited the Lord's Prayer and showed no sign of his previous possession. The account concludes that the possession had been genuine and that Lukens returned to his old life, completely cured. He largely faded into obscurity after his spectacular exorcism. Though he returned to Yatton, he made repeated attempts to move to Bristol. Apparently, he enjoyed his time there. Unfortunately for him, he had no income to speak of. Presumably his skills as a tailor had become rather rusty by then, and depended on his parish for support. Since nobody in Bristol seemed inclined to finance his transfer, he was forced to remain in Yatton. Nothing more was heard of him until February 1805, when an article in the Bristol Mirror was published announcing death.
According to the article, Lukens had been living in extreme poverty, except for the money he raised by begging and selling smoke books. He had also been a chronic invalid with numerous hypochondriacal complaints. Many people claimed that he was never cured from the possession. No real information was provided about the cause of his death. His memory of screams and various sounds lives on in Yatton till this day.